From Operation Dudula to the Patriotic Alliance, the focus has been on foreign labour. A good number of parties and organisations are saying South Africans must be put first. Terms like critical skills have also been bandied about. But what does the law actually say? Let's unpack this with Grant Wilkinson, Director and Senior Practicing Attorney at Kirchmanns Inc. Grant, thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We've had so many things being said about the current laws, and I'll talk about the proposals in a bit. But let's talk about the current labour laws and what it says when it comes to employing foreigners in South Africa.
Well, I think always, you have different laws of application. You've got the Immigration Act and you've got the Refugee Act of application. On top of that, you also have, from a compliance perspective, employment equity compliance, where there's certain targets set for certain businesses, and obviously in that instance, you're targeting certain groupings depending on your workforce profile analysis, your employment equity plan, etc. But obviously, in terms of the Immigration Act, etc., you must have your necessary paperwork in order, the necessary visas, work permits, etc., to carry on employment.
Yeah.
And it's quite detailed, from work permits all the way through to holiday visas, you name it. Yeah.
So is there no quota currently in place?
No.
No.
No. Employment equity, obviously, there's certain targets in place, and but immigration side, no.
Yeah. And then just in terms of hiring a foreigner who is in the country legally, that goes outside of any specific list, especially when it comes to critical skills, or do you need to have
You need to have critical skills preference is given to people with critical skills, and you can't just employ foreigners randomly, and particularly on lesser terms than South Africans. And that's something that also is coming in and be quantified quite clearly with the amendments, yeah.
But is that actually happening in South Africa? Because if you look at apps like Uber and Bolt, for instance, right? What does the law say in that regard? Because that's been raised quite a lot when you listen to Operation Dudula, the Patriotic Alliance, etc.
Yeah, Uber and Bolt are definitely... the question is always, are they employers? Yeah or no? Is it a contractor situation? And that issue is obviously left hanging with in South Africa at the moment, but no doubt it's gaining traction in foreign jurisdictions, and obviously we'll take guidance from that in terms of the employment relationship there. Yeah.
And just to be clear, because we heard Operation Dudula members yesterday go to businesses in Pretoria and say to them, you need to employ a majority of South Africans, locals first over foreigners. That's not correct.
It's not correct, but if you look at the Employment Equity Act as an example, which is probably not something that they're focusing on with their current process. Employment Equity Act will look at also setting targets in terms of your levels of compliance. And if you look at the targets in terms of Employment Equity Act, obviously there it limits your amount of foreigners that you can employ, and also set certain targets in terms of your black being broad, African, Indian and coloured population against your regional and sectoral targets, etc., versus disabled and gender targets obviously as well.
Yeah. The reality is that there are some businesses that are not following the labour laws currently to the T, which is why we're seeing more foreigners being employed and many South Africans arguing it's cheap labour.
Yeah, there are businesses out there that don't comply, and I think it's the usual question of, we have the laws in place, the laws are there, but the question is just about enforcement. And it's a question of, how do we put mechanisms in place to properly support the inspectorate and labour inspectorate, and to make certain they can do their job properly, and make certain that the law goes from a piece of paper to actually proper effective implementation. I think if it's effectively implemented, our laws will ensure compliance.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the proposals, because the Labour Department developed a new national labour migration policy and then proposed amendments to the existing Employment Services Act.
Yes.
Those proposals are supposed to actually ensure that it's a larger population of South Africans that's employed over foreigners.
Yeah.
Take us through how that is looking.
Well, what that's looking at, obviously it's a proposal at the moment. It's open for comments for a month, from the end of February till probably about close to the end of March. And what it's looking at is saying, well, you know what, before you employ a foreigner, first look at, obviously, is there a skill in South Africa? I think that's important. If there's no skill in South Africa, can you justify that? Yeah. Then you've got to look at saying, do the people you're hiring, do they have necessary paperwork in place? And I think sometimes some businesses, and I think it's important, there is credible business out there, and there's always, any sector, there's always chance takers out there. Credible businesses will make sure the paperwork's in order, etc. And it's also about the inspectorate enforcing properly. Where current proposals are, is that make certain the paperwork's in order. Make certain that it is a critical skill. And there's a critical skills list out there which sets out quite clearly what skills are deemed as critical. The third aspect is looking at transfer of skills. Having the South Africans that are available being trained up by foreign nationals if there's a requirement for a foreign national, amongst other things. And obviously making certain that that paperwork is kept for the requisite time period. And I think overall some of those things are already in play. as just quantifying and putting greater detail. There is talk of quotas in certain sectors, in certain geographies, and in certain occupational categories as well. But one has to get proper stats before you actually consider putting quotas in place in terms of hiring of foreigners.
But ultimately, government is saying that's basically what this is meant to address, quotas, where you employ more locals over foreigners. And just in terms of critical skills, looking at the current proposal on these amendments, right? Is it saying that you first have to employ South Africans? If you can't find a skill, then only you're allowed to employ a foreigner for that position?
Well, it's saying that if you require a skill, if there's no skill in South Africa, make certain you got hiring someone with a work permit. Thereafter, make certain that the person transfers a skill to South Africans as well. That way, trying to increase the marketplace. We also can't we've got to be careful when you try and put quotas in place because, you know, do we have the requisite skill set in South Africa, number one? For certain jobs. And there are jobs, no doubt, where we have skill sets, and in fact, we also have a brain drain out of South Africa. It's balancing that act. On top of that, it's making certain that when we bring guys in, they train locals up so that eventually the locals are able to fulfill that post. But and inevitably putting quotas in place. But when you put quotas in place, there's two things you have to look at. Do we have good market research and good stats and accurate statistics? And number two is, do we have an inspectorate that's able to enforce and are enforcing properly? And do they have they might be willing to, but do they have a requisite, is enough resources in place for them to properly and enforce? Which
is the biggest criticism of the Labour Department, which is why you have Operation Dudula and the Patriotic Alliance saying we're going to inspect because you can't do this yourself. But lastly, you talk about critical skills, but truck drivers, waiters, you know, those kind of jobs. Foreign locals first in those positions, according to this proposal. Is that something that we're seeing in this proposal or not?
I think it's just a question of will it be difficult to hire a foreigner in that position if they don't follow critical skills? Yes. There's no doubt going forward. That's what we're going to want to battle with. Because the question is this a skill that a South African can't do? You know, and if there isn't South Africans that can fulfill the vacancy, then you can go to foreigners. But in certain positions, as you're saying, it will be very difficult to justify not hiring a South African before hiring a foreigner. That's why in the Balancing Act with employment, making certain that there's job creation, a business environment that's creating this sort of space for job creation in South Africa, but also sustaining and making certain you don't have graduates sitting out there looking for employment as we have at the moment in such a high unemployment rate.
Which is our reality. And that's how many other countries work, by the way, because I can't just go into the United States and say, I'm going to work here, because they have a whole a process in place to ensure that doesn't happen.
And there is quotas, not quotas, but there is a sort of generally accepted percentage out there. And the last research done a few years ago, we fell within that ambit of the generally accepted number. So,
Okay, thank you so much for your time and insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.